There is a sea at the centre of the world, not the centre of every map you have ever seen, not the centre of every ocean, but the centre, the absolute gravitational cultural and historical centre of the world as humanity understood it for most of recorded time. The Romans called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. They said it the way you say it about something you love so much you forget other people might want it too. They said it the way empires always speak about the things they have taken and renamed and made their own. The Mediterranean stretches across roughly 2.5 million square kilometres of saltwater, and it is bordered by 3 continents. To the north, the old kingdoms of Europe, Greece, Italy, Spain, France. To the south, the ancient sands of North Africa, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, the ghost of Carthage still somewhere beneath the topsoil. To the east, the Levant, the gateway to everything else. Persia, India, the Silk Road, the trade that kept the ancient world breathing. For thousands of years, the Mediterranean was not just a sea, it was the engine of civilization. Every major power of the ancient world either sat on its shores or desperately wanted to. Every religion that shaped the modern world was either born near it or carried across it. Every great empire, Egyptian, Phoenician, Greek, Carthaginian, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, rose and fell within sight of its water, and the sea remembers all of it. The archaeology of the Mediterranean seafloor is a discipline that has only truly come into its own in the last half-century, and even in that time it has rewritten the textbooks of the ancient world more thoroughly than any comparable field of inquiry. Every decade brings new technology that can reach deeper, see more clearly, and extract more information from fragile and ancient materials. Every decade brings new discoveries that force us to revise our understanding of what the past was like, how connected, how sophisticated, how fully human in all the ways that matter. And the sea has barely been scratched. The estimates of what remains unfound are staggering, and they grow more staggering the more precisely we define the question. The Mediterranean has approximately 2.5 million square kilometres of surface, and the average depth of about 1,500 metres, and it has been the primary highway of the most historically consequential civilizations on Earth for at least 4,000 years of intensive maritime activity. The number of ships that have sunk in it during that period is a number that no one has been able to calculate with any confidence, but conservative estimates begin in the tens of thousands. We have found and studied a few hundred, the rest are waiting. They have always been waiting. They will wait as long as it takes. Down in the dark, beneath the shipping lanes and the tourist beaches and the fishing nets, beneath all the noise of the modern world riding on the surface, there are wrecks, there are cities, there are statues, amphora, coins, bones, weapons, libraries, laboratories, palaces, and harbours. There are things that were lost so completely that the civilizations that built them forgot they had ever existed. There are things that were deliberately sunk to hide them, or sunk by accident in storms that came out of nowhere on a clear day, or dragged to the bottom by the weight of their own ambition. The Mediterranean is the world's largest time capsule, and we have barely begun to open it. Tonight, or this afternoon, or this morning, or whatever strange hour it is where you are right now, we are going to descend into that water together. We are going to move through time the way a diver moves through depth, slowly, carefully, with our eyes wide open. We will start with a bronze machine so impossibly sophisticated that it was overlooked and misunderstood for decades after it was found. We will pass through the wreck of a Bronze Age ship that was carrying a cargo so diverse it reads like an inventory of the entire ancient world. We will walk the drowned streets of a Roman party city, where the emperors came to forget they were emperors. We will stand at the edge of a volcanic catastrophe so enormous it may have inspired the legend of Atlantis. We will watch fleets of galleys go down in the largest naval battle of the 16th century, and we will sit with the divers and archaeologists who are, even now, pulling the past back up into the light. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet where curiosity and history meet in the dark. And thank you, truly, for being here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I know someone out there is watching at midnight with a cup of tea going cold on the nightstand, the rest of the house completely quiet, and this is the only voice in the room. This one is for you. Let's go under. In the spring of 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers were returning from North Africa, following the old routes that their fathers and their fathers' fathers had sailed for generations. They were caught by a storm near the small island of Antikythera, which sits in the channel between Crete and the Greek mainland like a stone dropped carelessly into the water. When the storm eased enough for them to dive, because sponge divers dive even after storms, because the sea doesn't pay for rest, one of them, a man named Elias Stadiatis, went down about 45 metres and came back up white-faced and trembling. He told the others he had found a heap of rotting corpses and horses on the seafloor. The captain, Demetrios Kondos, thought the man was suffering from nitrogen narcosis, that strange, dreamy confusion that comes with depth, and went down himself to see. What he found was not corpses. It was a shipwreck, and it was enormous, and it was full of bronze. He brought up a single object to show the others, a bronze arm broken at the elbow, the muscle definition still visible after 2,000 years in the sea. The divers knew immediately that this was something extraordinary. They marked the location and sailed onto their home port of Symi, and then they went back to the Greek government and told them what they had found. What followed was the first major underwater archaeological recovery effort in history. From late 1900 through 1901, the Greek government sponsored a salvage operation at the Antikythera wreck, and the sponge divers went down again and again in their canvas suits, with their copper helmets, hauling up pieces of a world that had been silent for 2 millennia. They brought up marble statues, bronze sculptures, glassware, amphorae still sealed, still containing traces of wine that had turned to something unrecognizable. They brought up coins, jewellery, pottery, and the bones of those who had been aboard when the ship went down, probably sometime around 60 to 70 BCE, during the age of Julius Caesar, when Rome was busy tearing itself apart with ambition. And then, in May of 1901, a diver brought up a lump of corroded bronze and wood that nobody paid much attention to. It was the size of a large book, flat, irregular, clearly mechanical, but it was so encrusted with marine growth and corrosion that it was impossible to see what it was. It was catalogued, set aside, and largely forgotten for the next 50 years. The statues and the marbles were what captured the imagination. The statues were the story. The lump of bronze sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. It dried out. It cracked. Over the years, pieces flaked off, and those who noticed began to see something underneath. Gears. Not decorative gears, not simple gears, but precisely cut, interlocking triangular toothed gears of a complexity that belonged to an entirely different era of human history. At least 30 of them were eventually identified, along with dials and pointers and inscriptions in ancient Greek that mentioned the names of months and astronomical bodies. A British physicist named Derek de Solla Price became the first person to systematically study the mechanism in the 1950s and 60s, and what he concluded stunned the academic world. The Antikythera Mechanism, as it came to be called, was an analog astronomical computer. It was designed to predict the positions of the Sun, Moon, and possibly the 5 planets known to the ancient Greeks. It could calculate the timing of eclipses, not just that an eclipse would happen, but when and where it would be visible. It had a dial for tracking the 4-year cycle of the Olympiad, the ancient Greek sporting calendar. It was geared with a precision that, according to de Solla Price, represented a level of sophistication not seen again in human technology until the 14th century in Europe. Let that settle for a moment. This device was built roughly around 100 BCE. The next comparable mechanical device we know of, in terms of gearing complexity and precision, is the medieval astronomical clock of Richard of Wallingford, built around 1330 CE. That is a gap of 1400 years. 14 centuries during which the knowledge of how to build this thing was simply gone. Whatever workshop produced the Antikythera Mechanism, and scholars believe it was likely on the island of Rhodes, where a famous school of astronomy and mechanics was known to have flourished. That workshop's secrets died with it. Whether it was war or the slow collapse of the institutions that sustained complex craftsmanship, or simply the brutal randomness of what survives and what doesn't, the knowledge vanished. Modern analysis using X-ray tomography, CT scanning, and polynomial texture mapping has revealed even more than de Solla Price could see. Researchers from the Antikythera Mechanism research project published findings showing that the back of the device had a dial system for predicting eclipses based on the ancient Saros cycle, an 18-year, 11-day cycle used by Babylonian astronomers that was itself derived from centuries of careful observation. The device synthesized Greek, Babylonian, and possibly Egyptian astronomical knowledge into a single, portable, mechanical instrument. It was almost certainly used by someone who needed to predict celestial events for practical purposes, navigation, religious calendars, the scheduling of major festivals, or perhaps the timing of military campaigns, which the ancient world took very seriously in relation to celestial omens. The ship itself tells a story too. The Antikythera wreck was carrying an extraordinary cargo, not the cargo of a simple merchant, but the cargo of someone stripping a Greek world that was being absorbed into Rome. The statues and bronzes and glassware looked like the contents of elite Greek homes and temples being transported westward, toward Italy, toward the new centre of power. This was the age when Roman generals like Sulla had already plundered Athens, when the wealth of the Greek East was flowing toward Rome like blood from a wound. The ship may have been a Roman vessel carrying cultural trophies home, or a merchant ship carrying goods for sale to the newly wealthy Roman aristocracy that was developing a taste for Greek art. Whatever it was, it went down in a storm, and everything aboard settled into the sand 45 meters down, and the sea covered it up, and for 2,000 years it waited. The mechanism waited the longest of all, because nobody knew what they were looking at. That is perhaps the most haunting thing about it, that it sat in a museum for half a century, labelled and catalogued and physically present, and still effectively invisible, because the concept of it was so far outside what anyone expected that the mind simply slid off it. How many other objects in museum collections around the world are waiting for someone to look at them correctly? How many other lumps of corroded bronze are sitting in storage, waiting for a physicist or an engineer to pick them up and say, "Wait, these are gears?" The question is not rhetorical. In 2006, researchers examining objects in the storage rooms of a Greek museum identified a fragment of bronze that, on closer inspection, showed the unmistakable traces of fine and mechanical work. Tooth marks, a pivot point, the ghost of a gear. The fragment has not been definitively identified as related to the Antikythera Mechanism or to any other specific device, and the academic community has been appropriately cautious about what conclusions to draw. But the point is that the examination happened at all, and that it happened because someone was asking the right question, because the Antikythera Mechanism itself had taught the world to ask whether ancient bronze lumps might be something more than lumps. The mechanism's discovery, in other words, is still propagating forward through the history of the discipline, still changing what researchers look for and how they look, still reshaping what we think the ancient world was capable of producing. Since 1900, the Antikythera wreck site has been revisited multiple times. Between 2014 and 2017, a major new expedition using cutting-edge underwater technology discovered that the wreck is far larger than originally thought. The earlier divers had only recovered material from one portion of what was a very big ship. In 2017, a human skeleton was found, with enough bone material preserved to allow for DNA extraction. The results, when they came, were remarkable. The person, who has been nicknamed Pamphilos after a name scratched into one of the amphorae, showed genetic markers consistent with a person from the Eastern Mediterranean, possibly from Greece or Anatolia. This was the first time ancient DNA had been successfully extracted from someone who died in a shipwreck, and the first time we had put, however tentatively, a genetic face to the human cost of that particular storm on that particular night 2,000 years ago. There is almost certainly more of the mechanism on the seafloor. The fragments we have recovered account for perhaps a third of the original device, based on what the inscriptions and gear system suggest should be there. The rest may still be buried in the sediment near the wreck, broken, corroded, waiting. The Return to Antikythera project continues its work with every opportunity, using underwater robots and careful excavation to map what remains. And the possibility, the tantalizing, maddening possibility, is that somewhere under that sand there is a piece of ancient gearing that will tell us something new about what the ancient world was truly capable of, something that will force us once again to recalibrate our understanding of the distance between then and now. The Antikythera Mechanism is the most spectacular single object the Mediterranean has ever returned to us. A window cut directly into the mind of the ancient world at its most sophisticated. But the sea does not deal only in individual miracles. Sometimes it deals in entire worlds, and the world it has best preserved is the one that preceded ancient Greece itself, the world that made the classical Mediterranean possible, the interconnected, cosmopolitan, astonishingly complex universe of the late Bronze Age. To understand that world, we need to travel 3,000 years further back in time and several hundred kilometers to the east, to a shipwreck that does not contain any single extraordinary object, but instead contains, in the totality of its cargo, a portrait of a civilization in full flower. 3,200 years ago, a ship sank off the southern coast of what is now Turkey, near a place called Cape Uluburun. The ship was large by the standards of its day, somewhere between 15 and 16 meters long, and it was carrying what might be the single most remarkable cargo ever recovered from an ancient shipwreck. Not remarkable for its gold, though there was gold aboard. Not remarkable for its rarity, though some of what it carried was extraordinarily rare. Remarkable because of what the full manifest tells us about the world that produced it. A world far more interconnected, far more commercially sophisticated, and far more cosmopolitan than anyone had previously imagined. The wreck was found in 1982 by a Turkish sponge diver named Mehmet Çakir, who reported seeing metal biscuits on the seafloor, flat, round, heavy objects that turned out to be copper ingots of a type called oxhide ingots, named for their distinctive shape, which resembles a stretched animal hide with handles at the four corners. He reported his find to the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, and what followed was one of the longest and most important underwater excavation projects in history. Between 1984 and 1994, a team, led by American nautical archaeologist George Bass and his colleagues, conducted 22,000 dives on the wreck over 11 seasons, working at depths between 44 and 61 meters, in conditions that pushed both the technology and the human body to their limits. What they found, piece by piece, season by season, was nothing less than a snapshot of the late Bronze Age world at its height. The cargo included 10 tons of copper ingots, approximately 354 of the oxide type, and dozens of others, almost certainly originating from Cyprus, which was the ancient world's primary source of copper and which gave the metal its very name, since the Latin cuprum derives from Kypros, the ancient name for the island. The copper would have been used to make bronze, and bronze was to the late Bronze Age what steel is to the modern world, the material on which civilization ran, from weapons to tools to the hinges on doors. Alongside the copper were 1 ton of tin ingots. Tin was the other, essential ingredient in bronze, and unlike copper, it did not exist anywhere in the Mediterranean. It had to come from somewhere far away, modern Afghanistan, or possibly Central Asia, or the tin mines of Cornwall in Britain, moving along trade routes of staggering length across the ancient world before it reached the Mediterranean basin. Someone had obtained a ton of it, and it was on this ship bound for somewhere. There were also 150 Canaanite amphorae, the clay jars of the ancient Levantine world, filled with resin, olives, and other organic materials. There were glass ingots, raw cobalt blue glass, a luxury material manufactured in Egypt and sold throughout the Mediterranean. There were faience objects, ebony logs from Africa, hippopotamus teeth, a ton of terebinth resin used for perfume and ritual purposes, and ostrich eggshells. There were ivory in the form of elephant tusks, and hippopotamus teeth worked into objects. There were finished bronze tools and weapons, swords, daggers, spearheads. There were Egyptian objects, a gold scarab bearing the cartouche of Nefertiti, the famous queen of Akhenaten. There were Canaanite gold jewellery pieces, cylinder seals from Mesopotamia, Mycenaean Greek pottery, and Baltic amber from the coast of northern Europe, from the Baltic Sea, which had travelled thousands of miles overland and by sea to end up on a cargo ship in the eastern Mediterranean. The diversity of the cargo's origin is almost impossible to overstate. On a single ship, in a single hull, at a single moment in time, there were objects from Egypt, Cyprus, Canaan, Mycenaean Greece, Syria, Mesopotamia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and the Baltic coast of northern Europe. This was not a ship of curiosities. This was a normal merchant vessel of the late Bronze Age, and its cargo represents the normal commerce of a world that was far more connected, far more globalized, if that word is not too anachronistic, than historians had previously given it credit for. The Uluburun ships sank around 1300 BCE, give or take a few decades. This is the age of Rameses the Great in Egypt. It is the age of the Hittite Empire at its peak in Anatolia. It is the age of the Mycenaean palace civilization in Greece, the civilization that Homer would later mythologize in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And all of these civilizations, it now appears, were trading with each other constantly, along routes that were carefully maintained and well understood, in a system of commerce sophisticated enough to sustain the movement of Baltic amber from the beaches of Lithuania to the cargo hold of a Canaanite ship sailing off the coast of Turkey. The ship itself appears to have been Canaanite, from the Levantine coast, what is now Lebanon and Israel, based on the construction methods and some of the personal items found aboard. There were at least 2 Mycenaean Greek passengers or merchants aboard based on their personal objects. There may have been Egyptians. The crew was likely diverse, as crews tend to be on any vessel that travels widely. This was a cosmopolitan vessel serving a cosmopolitan world, and the storm or reef or mechanical failure that sank it was an ordinary catastrophe in an ordinary commercial life that connected continents. What makes the Uluburun wreck even more poignant is what came after. Within about a century of its sinking, the entire world it represented collapsed. The late Bronze Age collapse, which occurred roughly between 1200 and 1150 BCE, was one of the most catastrophic societal collapses in human history. Within a few decades, the Mycenaean palace civilization vanished. Its great citadels at Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos burned or abandoned. The Hittite Empire, which had controlled most of Anatolia for centuries, ceased to exist almost overnight. Egypt survived but was severely weakened, losing control of the Levantine coast it had dominated. City after city around the eastern Mediterranean was burned or abandoned. The palace economies that had sustained the long-distance trade represented by the Uluburun cargo simply stopped functioning. The causes of the Bronze Age collapse are still debated fiercely among historians and archaeologists, and the honest answer is that we do not fully know. Climate change, specifically a prolonged drought that appears in the pollen records and in desperate letters preserved on clay tablets, played a significant role, destroying the agricultural base that supported the palace economies. A group called the Sea Peoples, named in Egyptian records, conducted raids along the Mediterranean coast during this period, contributing to the destruction of cities. But whether the Sea Peoples caused the collapse or were themselves refugees created by it, displaced populations fleeing other catastrophes, remains unclear. Earthquakes, internal rebellions, the breakdown of trade networks, plague, all have been proposed, and the truth is probably some terrible combination of all of them arriving at once. The ship at Uluburun went down before all of that. It sank in the last years of a functioning world, carrying the produce of that world in its hold, and it went to the bottom while the civilization that built it still stood. By the time anyone might have gone looking for it, there was no one left who remembered the world it had sailed through. The palace records that might have documented its voyage were ash. The merchants who might have mourned its loss were gone. The trade routes it had travelled were abandoned. The sea closed over it, and the Bronze Age world went on without it for another century or so before the collapse came, and then there was nothing left to remember either of them. The Bronze Age collapse was the end of one Mediterranean world and the slow beginning of another. The civilizations that emerged from the rubble, the Phoenicians from the Levantine coast, the Greeks from the Aegean, the Assyrians from Mesopotamia, and eventually Rome from the Italian peninsula, built a new connected world over the following centuries, and one of the most powerful cities that New World produced was the one that Rome would eventually decide needed to be entirely erased from history. The story of Carthage is the story of that erasure, and of why it never quite worked. There is a moment in the history of the ancient Mediterranean that stands as one of the most deliberate acts of cultural destruction ever committed, and it happened in the spring of 146 BCE on the North African coast near what is now the city of Tunis. A Roman army under the general Scipio Aemilianus had besieged the city of Carthage for 3 years, methodically destroying its outer defences, its port, its neighbourhood by neighbourhood. When the last defenders fell back to the citadel, the Byrsa Hill, and surrender finally came, the Romans did not simply occupy the city. They burned it. They burned it for 17 days. The fires were visible from ships at sea. Then they pulled down what the fire had left standing. Then, according to the most dramatic version of the story, the one that may be partially legendary, but which captured the ancient imagination immediately, they salted the earth so that nothing would ever grow there again. Whether the salting actually happened is debated by modern historians. Salt was expensive, the area is large, and the practical symbolism may have been enough without the literal act. But what is not in dispute is the intention. Rome wanted Carthage not merely defeated, not merely occupied, but gone, erased, reduced to a warning and a memory, and eventually not even a memory. There is a phrase attributed to the Roman senator Cato the Elder, who ended every speech he gave in the years before the final war with the same 3 words, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, and yet Carthage survives. Not in the way Rome wanted, not as a living city, but in the ground, in the sea, in the archaeology. Carthage survives with extraordinary stubbornness, as if the city itself refused to accept the terms of its own destruction. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what Carthage was before Rome decided to eliminate it. Carthage was founded, according to ancient tradition, by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre in what is now Lebanon, around 814 BCE. The founding story involves a queen named Dido, also called Elissa, who fled the political machinations of her brother Pygmalion, who had murdered her husband to take his wealth. Dido gathered followers, sailed west across the Mediterranean, and came to the North African coast. The local king, according to the legend, agreed to give her as much land as could be covered by a single ox hide. Dido, who was clever in the way that founding myths always require their heroes to be clever, cut the hide into the thinnest possible strips, tied them end to end, and used the resulting length to encircle the entire hill she had chosen. She called it Byrsa, from the Greek word for hide, and on that hill she built her city. This founding story is probably not literally true, but it encodes something real. Carthage was founded by people who were comfortable with maritime trade, who understood the value of a good harbour, and who were clever enough to turn disadvantage into advantage. The city grew on a peninsula jutting into the Gulf of Tunis, with a natural double harbour, an outer merchant harbour and an inner circular military harbour that made it one of the finest naval bases in the Mediterranean. Over the centuries, Carthage became the dominant commercial power of the Western Mediterranean, controlling the trade routes to Spain, to the Atlantic coast of Africa, to Sardinia, to Sicily. Carthaginian ships sailed to the Canary Islands and almost certainly along the West African coast. A Carthaginian admiral named Hanno the Navigator led an expedition sometime around 500 BCE that may have reached as far as modern Sierra Leone or Cameroon, making it one of the most extraordinary voyages of the ancient world. At its height, before the Punic Wars began in 264 BCE, Carthage controlled territory stretching across northern Africa, much of Spain, the Western Mediterranean islands, and maintained a commercial network that touched every corner of the known world. Its population was somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 people, a city of a size comparable to Rome at the same period. It had temples, libraries, agricultural treatises. One Carthaginian writer named Maco wrote a 28-volume work on farming that was considered authoritative enough that the Roman Senate, after destroying Carthage, specifically had it translated into Latin and preserved. The Romans destroyed everything about Carthage that they could, and preserved only the farming manual, which tells you something about what they thought was worth keeping, and what they were afraid might outlast them. The 3 Punic Wars, the first from 264 to 241 BCE, the second from 218 to 201 BCE, the third and final from 149 to 146 BCE, were the defining conflict of the Western Mediterranean, and the second of them produced one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. A Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca, the son of a general who had fought Rome in the First War, took an army from Carthaginian Spain across the Alps in the winter of 218 BCE, with elephants, which he used as psychological weapons against enemies who had never seen them, and spent the next 15 years ravaging Italy. He destroyed Roman armies at the Trebbia River, at Lake Trasimene, and at Cannae, where an estimated 70,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon's battle in what military historians still study as perhaps the most tactically perfect victory in ancient warfare. Hannibal never took Rome. His campaign ultimately failed. Rome had deeper reserves of manpower and will than he could exhaust, and Carthage was eventually defeated, crippled, and left to survive under humiliating conditions. But the memory of Hannibal at the gates, of Italy burning, of the screams at Cannae, never left the Roman consciousness, and it was that memory, as much as any strategic calculation, that drove the ultimate decision to destroy Carthage completely. The Romans were afraid of it in the way you're afraid of something that once genuinely hurt you, and when they finally had the chance, they made sure there was nothing left to fear. What the sea preserved is more than what Rome intended. The ancient harbours of Carthage, the circular military harbour, the Kothon, was approximately 300 metres in diameter, ringed with docks for 220 warships, have been partially excavated underwater. The port silted up over the centuries after Rome's destruction, and centuries of later habitation, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, buried much of what remained. But archaeological investigations, beginning seriously in the 20th century, and continuing intensively since the 1970s under a UNESCO-sponsored international project, have found extraordinary things beneath the surface. The Punic ports, as they are called, were rediscovered by dredging operations in the early 20th century that began pulling up ancient artefacts, and systematic investigation revealed the outlines of the circular harbour's original structure. Beneath the waters and the mud of the outer harbour, archaeologists have found evidence of the sheds where Carthage's warships, the fast manoeuvrable galleys called quinqueremes, were stored and maintained. The slipways, designed to haul warships out of the water for repair and protection from the weather, are still there. Stone ramps descending into the silted harbour floor, waiting. The residential neighbourhoods of Punic Carthage, the neighbourhoods that were burned and pulled down by the Romans, have been excavated on the Byrsa Hill and in surrounding areas, and they reveal a city of sophisticated urban planning. Multi-story houses with proper drainage systems, mosaic floors, elaborate storage facilities. The Tophet, a Carthaginian sacred precinct that has been the centre of one of history's most bitter archaeological controversies, has been found and partially excavated, and the debate about what exactly happened there continues to generate passionate arguments among scholars. The ancient Roman and Greek sources claim that the Carthaginians practiced child sacrifice in the Tophet, burning infants as offerings to their gods Baal-Hamon and Tanit. The physical evidence from the site, urns containing the cremated remains of children and sometimes animals, is real. What it means is the question. Were these children sacrificed, or were they children who died of other causes and were given this particular form of burial? The answer matters enormously for how we understand Carthaginian civilization, and the physical evidence alone cannot resolve it, which means the controversy is likely to continue for a very long time. What is certain is that the Carthaginians who built this city, who sailed its ships and maintained its ports and wrote its agricultural treaties, left behind something that survived the Roman determination to erase them. The sea held some of it, the ground held more, and in the ongoing excavations at Carthage, and in the continuing analysis of what has already been found, a civilization that Rome tried to unmake is slowly reassembling itself. Carthage tried to reassemble itself through archaeology, pulling the facts of its existence back from beneath the topsoil and the harbour mud. Alexandria went a different route. It did not need to reassemble itself, because the sea caught a large portion of it intact and has been holding it there ever since, waiting for divers with the right equipment to come and look. While Carthage is a story of what was destroyed on land and partially survived underground, Alexandria is a story of what sank into the water and was preserved by it, of a city that, even in its drowned remnants, is still recognisably the most extraordinary place in the ancient world. Alexander the Great founded somewhere between 16 and 70 cities, depending on which ancient source you believe and how generously you define founded. Most of them faded back into the landscape within a few generations. One of them became, for a period of several centuries, perhaps the most important city in the world. Alexandria was founded in 331 BCE on the Egyptian coast, where the Nile Delta meets the Mediterranean, and Alexander chose the site personally, reputedly walking out the city's boundaries himself, using grain instead of chalk to mark the lines because that's what the locals happened to have available. He watched birds eat the grain and took it as a good omen, which either shows remarkable optimism or a very flexible relationship with signs from the divine. Either way, he was right about the city. Alexander never saw Alexandria completed. He marched east into Persia and Mesopotamia and India, and eventually died in Babylon in 323 BCE, at the age of 32, before his new city was much more than a construction site. But the man he left in charge of Egypt, one of his generals, a Macedonian named Ptolemy, was shrewd enough to understand what the location offered and ambitious enough to do something about it. Ptolemy brought Alexander's body to Alexandria for burial, which gave the city immediate prestige as the resting place of a man who was already being deified by his former subjects. He declared himself pharaoh, founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, and began building a city that would make the intellectual and cultural capital of his kingdom impossible to ignore. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous institution of the ancient world, and it is surrounded by so many myths and misunderstandings that separating what was real from what was legendary requires some care. The library was not a single building. It was part of the Mausion, a complex of institutions dedicated to scholarship and research, named for the Muses, and functioning somewhat like a combination of a great research university, a state-funded think tank, and a royal collection. At its height, it is estimated to have contained somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, handwritten papyrus rolls that were the books of the ancient world, representing the sum total of Greek knowledge across mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, literature, and everything else that the Hellenistic world had collected and organised and thought about. The scholars who worked at the library or in its associated institutions included some of the most consequential minds of the ancient world. Euclid formalised the principles of geometry there, producing a textbook so comprehensive that it was still being used to teach mathematics 2,000 years later. Eratosthenes, the chief librarian, calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than a stick, a known distance, and the angle of the sun's shadow at the summer solstice in 2 different locations. His result was within a few % of the actual figure. Archimedes, though based in Syracuse, was in intellectual correspondence with Alexandria and may have studied there. Herophilus and Erasistratus conducted the first systematic human anatomical dissections in Alexandria, laying the foundations of medical knowledge that dominated for centuries. Aristarchus of Samos proposed, while at Alexandria, that the Earth orbited the Sun, a heliocentric model that would not gain acceptance for nearly 2,000 years, until Copernicus arrived at essentially the same conclusion. The library did not die in a single dramatic fire, which is one of the most persistent myths attached to it. Julius Caesar's troops accidentally burned a warehouse full of books near the harbour during his visit to Alexandria in 48 BCE, which ancient sources describe and which may have been genuinely significant. But the library itself continued to function. The institution declined gradually across several centuries as political instability, changing patronage, and the fragmentation of the Roman Empire made sustained intellectual investment hard to maintain. By the time the Arab conquest of Egypt came in 641 CE, what remained of the library as an active institution was probably already gone, and the famous story of the Arab general Amr ibn al-As ordering the burning of its books because they either agree with the Quran, in which case they are superfluous, or they disagree, in which case they are heretical, is almost certainly a later invention. The library did not end in a moment. It faded across centuries, which is arguably more melancholy than any single fire. But the physical city, the palaces, the harbours, the monuments, that is a different story, and the sea has preserved more of it than the land has. The ancient royal quarter of Alexandria, the Bruchaion, where the Ptolemaic palaces stood and where the Musion was housed, has been slowly disappearing into the sea for 2,000 years. The northeastern coast of Alexandria has subsided. The land has sunk, the sea has risen, or more likely both, and what was once the most prestigious real estate in the ancient world now lies beneath the waters of the eastern harbour. In 1994, a French underwater archaeologist named Frank Gaudiot began a systematic survey of the eastern harbour using advanced sonar and remote sensing equipment, and what he found transformed the field. Beneath the harbour, waters, at depths of between 5 and 8 metres, shallow enough that good visibility is sometimes possible, Gaudiot's team found the ruins of the royal quarter, collapsed columns, sphinx statues, enormous obelisks lying on the seafloor, fragments of temple walls, harbour infrastructure, and what appears to be the island of Antiochos, where Cleopatra herself is said to have had a palace. The island sank below the waterline sometime after the great earthquake and tsunami of 365 CE, which devastated much of the eastern Mediterranean coast, and it has been underwater ever since. The objects recovered from the eastern harbour are astonishing in their state of preservation and their historical significance. Statues of pharaohs and sphinxes still wearing their carved jewellery and headdresses, a colossal statue that may represent the god Hapi, deity of the Nile's inundation, red granite columns, foundations of structures that match the descriptions of ancient writers, and most, poignantly perhaps, the personal objects that belong to the people who lived and worked there. Pottery, coins, small statuary, the detritus of daily life in a city that was once the most cosmopolitan place on earth. The most famous single building associated with ancient Alexandria is the lighthouse, the Pharos of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. built during the reign of Ptolemy II, completed around 280 BCE, and standing on the small island of Pharos in the harbour, it was the tallest man-made structure in the world for centuries, somewhere between 120 and 140 metres high, a tower of white stone with a fire burning at its summit that could be seen, ancient sources claim, from a distance of 50 kilometres or more. For 600 years it guided ships into Alexandria's harbour. Then, over several centuries beginning around the 10th century CE, a series of earthquakes damaged and ultimately toppled it. By the 15th century, the Egyptian Sultan Qaitbay used stones from the ruined lighthouse to build a fortress on the same site, the citadel of Qaitbay, which still stands there today. But Pharos Island and the surrounding seafloor still hold the lighthouse's remains. In 1994, the same year Goddio began his work on the eastern harbour, Egyptian authorities began surveying the seafloor near the citadel, and they found them. Enormous stone blocks, some weighing hundreds of tons, lying on the seafloor in depths of 6 to 8 metres, columns, statues of sphinxes and pharaohs, the physical remains of the pharaohs scattered by earthquakes across the seafloor, some blocks still so large that lifting them would require specialised equipment. The blocks have been mapped and studied, and analysis of their composition and style confirms what their location suggests. These are pieces of the most famous lighthouse in history, still there, still holding their position on the seafloor of Alexandria's harbour 2,500 years after they were first put together by Ptolemaic stonemasons who were trying to build something worthy of the world's greatest city. If you were fabulously wealthy in the Roman world, and if you wanted to escape the noise and obligation of Rome for a few days or weeks, and if you were the kind of person who had opinions about the quality of hot spring water and the precise temperature at which oysters should be served, then there was only one place to go. Baia sat on the western coast of Italy, in the volcanic region called the Phlegraean Fields, the burning fields just north of Naples, and for several centuries it was the most exclusive resort destination in the ancient world. Emperors went there, generals went there, poets went there and wrote about how beautiful it was, philosophers went there and complained about how dissolute it was. Cicero had a villa there, Julius Caesar had a villa there, Nero had a villa there, several of them in fact, because Nero was the kind of emperor who collected experiences the way other people collect debts. The Phlegraean Fields are geologically extraordinary, a massive volcanic system that includes multiple craters, thermal springs, volcanic gases rising through the ground, and a phenomenon called bradycism, which is the slow rise and fall of the land surface caused by magma movement underground. The landscape is dramatic and slightly unsettling. The ground is warm in places. The water near the shore is heated by submarine volcanic vents, and the smell of sulphur is never entirely absent. The Romans, who associated sulphurous heat with the entrance to the underworld, called nearby Lake Avernus the gateway to hell and built myths around it. The poet Virgil set the opening of Aeneas's descent to the underworld there. But the Romans were also deeply pragmatic people, and what they mostly saw when they looked at Baia was opportunity. The thermal springs made natural hot baths without any heating, infrastructure. The mild climate was gentle year-round. The bay was sheltered and beautiful. The seafood, thanks to those volcanic vents warming the shallow water, was exceptional. And the relative remove from Rome, about 170 kilometres, a few days' comfortable travel by road or a day by sea, was far enough to feel like a real escape and close enough to return quickly if political necessities demanded it. The town they built there over the course of several centuries was extraordinary. Terraced villas climb the hillsides, extending out over the water on elaborate platforms and piers, with views across the bay. Thermal bath complexes, the Romans called them thermae, were built at different levels of the hillside, fed by springs of different temperatures, so that visitors could move from room to room experiencing progressively hotter or cooler water in a sequence designed for both pleasure and what the Romans believed were health benefits. The architecture was innovative. The baths of Baia include some of the earliest examples of Roman concrete dome construction, predecessors to the Pantheon in Rome, experiments in how far a dome could span without columns underneath it. The social life of Baia was legendary, and not always in a flattering way. Ancient writers describe it as a place where the normal rules of Roman propriety were temporarily suspended, where married women behaved with the freedom of unmarried ones, where drinking began early and ended late, where the mixing of social classes that Rome's rigid hierarchy normally prevented became acceptable in the heat and the wine and the general holiday atmosphere. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who struggled all his life to reconcile his philosophical commitments with his enormous wealth, wrote a letter from Baia describing the noise from the resort below his window, the singing, the splashing, the sound of people who had forgotten or temporarily abandoned the idea of being serious. And you can hear in his words both his disapproval and, underneath it, the faintest trace of envy. Emperors built the grandest structures of all. Claudius began an ambitious expansion of the harbour. Nero, who had less restraint than Claudius and more aesthetic ambition, built a massive complex that occupied much of the shoreline, including structures that were later remembered as the Palace of Neptune and the so-called Temple of Diana, though neither was actually a temple, and neither was actually dedicated to the gods those names suggest. They were imperial pleasure structures, thermae and dining halls and reception rooms built on a scale that said, unmistakably, this belongs to someone who can do anything they want. Then the Bradycism happened. The land began to sink, slowly, imperceptibly at first, then measurably across the centuries, and the sea began to claim the shoreline. By the medieval period, much of what had been Baia's waterfront was underwater. By the modern period, the villas and the thermae and the harbour structures that had once hosted the most powerful people in the ancient world lay beneath 4 to 6 metres of water in the Bay of Pozzuoli, home now to fish and sea, grass and the occasional curious diver. The underwater archaeological park of Baia, established in 2002, is one of the most remarkable heritage sites in the world, and one of the most accessible. Because the water is relatively shallow and relatively clear, it is possible to snorkel or dive among the ruins without any advanced training, to swim above mosaic floors that are still in situ, to follow the lines of walls that were built by Roman craftsmen 2,000 years ago, to pass over threshold stones worn smooth by the sandaled feet of people who came to Baia when it was the most fashionable place in the Mediterranean world. Statues have been recovered from the site, including the famous statue of an octopus-entwined figure that became an icon of the park, and replicas have been placed on the seafloor so that divers can experience the context in which they were found. What makes Baia particularly haunting is the sense of accidental time capsule. This was not a city destroyed by war or catastrophe in a moment. It was a city that simply got wet slowly over centuries until the water had covered it, and those who lived there moved elsewhere, and what remained was left to the sea. The mosaic floors that divers swim over today were not destroyed. They were submerged, and the Mediterranean, which is relatively low in oxygen at depth, and which has few of the wood-boring organisms that destroy organic material in the Atlantic, preserved them with remarkable fidelity. You can see the individual tesserae of the mosaics, the geometric patterns and figural scenes that decorated the floors of what were, in their time, among the most luxurious rooms in the world. You can see the bases where statues stood, some still with the attachment points visible, waiting for a statue that was removed long ago. You can see the heating channels under the floors of the thermae, the Hipparcos system that circulated hot air to warm the rooms above, still intact, still in there. Original positions completely useless now, but perfectly preserved in their uselessness. The Bradycism has not stopped. The land around Pozzuoli and Baia continues to rise and fall, and in some periods, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, when volcanic activity in the area caused significant uplift, the seafloor of the bay has risen slightly, briefly bringing some of the ruins closer to the surface before subsiding again. This geological instability is a reminder that the whole region sits atop a system that is still very much active, that the landscape of Baia is not a finished thing but a work in progress, and that what the sea has kept, the Earth may yet decide to treat differently. Around 1600 BCE, the precise date is still debated, and the debates are genuinely intense, involving the cross-checking of ice core samples from Greenland, tree ring records from Irish bog oaks, radiocarbon dates from organic material at the site, and Egyptian chronologies that themselves have margins of error. A volcano erupted in the Aegean Sea with a violence that modern volcanologists rank among the largest eruptions in human history during the Holocene period. The island of Thera, which we now call Santorini, essentially destroyed itself. The volcanic cone that had been building for centuries collapsed inward as the magma chamber beneath it emptied, creating a caldera, a massive, roughly circular depression that then flooded with seawater, becoming the bay that defines the island's extraordinary crescent shape today. The eruption expelled somewhere between 60 and 100 cubic kilometers of material, ash, pumice, rock, into the atmosphere. For comparison, the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, which killed tens of thousands of people, lowered global temperatures by over 1 degree Celsius for several years, and was heard 5,000 kilometers away, expelled about 21 cubic kilometers of material. The Thera eruption was significantly larger. Its ash has been found in ice, cores from Greenland, in lake sediments from Anatolia and the Nile Delta, in the soil of sites across the eastern Mediterranean. The eruption would have been visible from hundreds of kilometers away. The sound would have been heard across the entire Aegean. The tsunamis generated by the caldera collapse would have reached the coasts of Crete, Greece, Turkey, and Egypt within hours, arriving as walls of water that would have swept away everything built within reach of the shore. On Thera itself there had been a city. The ancient settlement now called Akrotiri, buried under meters of volcanic ash on the island's southwestern tip, was excavated beginning in 1967 by the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, who had been searching for evidence of the eruption's impact on Minoan civilization for decades before the excavations confirmed it. What he found beneath the ash was extraordinary. A Bronze Age city of substantial size and sophistication, with 2- and 3-story buildings lining paved streets, interior staircases, ground-floor storage rooms and upper-floor living quarters, sophisticated drainage systems running beneath the streets, and walls covered in some of the finest frescoes ever produced in the Bronze Age world. The Akrotiri frescoes are among the most beautiful objects to survive from prehistory. They show a world of colour and life, blue monkeys climbing saffron-coloured rocks, a flotilla of ships sailing between flower-crowned landscapes, while men dive from the prows, a pair of young men boxing wearing leather helmets but still sporting the distinctive Minoan hairstyle of shaved heads with long locks falling to the sides. 2 antelope facing each other with the stylized grace that is characteristic of Minoan art at its most accomplished. A young woman gathering saffron flowers and placing them in a basket, her dress elaborate, her expression serene. These are not merely decorative paintings. They are windows into a world that was alive and sophisticated and aesthetically confident right up to the moment the Earth ended it. And then there are the people, or rather, the absence of them. Unlike at Pompeii, where the ash preserved the bodies of victims who were overtaken by the eruption, Akrotiri has yielded almost no human remains. The city had no people in it when the ash fell. There was plenty of warning. A series of earthquakes preceded the main eruption, sometimes months in advance, and the inhabitants of Akrotiri appear to have organised an evacuation. They left behind their furniture, their pottery, their food stores, their frescoes, their mills and their storage jars and their beds. They left behind everything too heavy or too fixed to take, which tells us that they intended to come back. They left behind, in other words, the record of a civilization that expected to survive. Whether they did, whether the people of Akrotiri found shelter elsewhere in the Aegean and continued their lives, we do not know, because they took their portable possessions and their written records with them, and we have never found where they went. The connection between the Thera eruption and the legend of Atlantis is one of the most seductive ideas in popular archaeology, and it has been circulating since the Greek scholar Angelos Gallinopoulos proposed it in the 1960s. Plato is our only ancient source for Atlantis, and he describes it in two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BCE. In Plato's account, he received the story from his relative Critias, who had it from Solon, the Athenian statesman and lawmaker who visited Egypt around 590 BCE, and was told by Egyptian priests that a great island civilization in the Atlantic Ocean had been destroyed 9,000 years earlier, sinking beneath the sea in a single catastrophic day and night. The Thera hypothesis argues that the Atlantis story is a distorted memory of the Minoan civilization's catastrophic encounter with the Thera eruption, that Plato's Atlantic Ocean is a mistake or a deliberate displacement for the Aegean, that his 9,000 years is actually 900 years, a tenfold error in translation from Egyptian to Greek numerical systems, that the destroyed island civilization is the Minoan world of the Bronze Age Aegean. There is genuine evidence that the Thera eruption severely damaged and may have contributed to the collapse of Minoan civilization on Crete. The great palaces of Knossos, Phaistos and Malea show signs of destruction around the right period, and while the exact sequence of events – eruption, tsunami, ashfall, political instability, invasion – is still disputed, there is no question that the Minoan world declined sharply in the centuries after Thera. Whether this was what Plato was encoding in his Atlantis narrative, or whether Atlantis was simply a philosophical fiction he invented to make a point about the hubris of powerful civilizations as most classical, scholars believe is a question the archaeology cannot fully resolve. But the Thera eruption is real, and its effects were real, and the civilization it damaged was real, and the possibility that the most famous legend of a sunken civilization has its roots in an actual catastrophe that reshaped the ancient Aegean world is genuinely exciting whether or not Plato ever heard a word of it. The sea floor around Santorini continues to be studied, and the caldera itself, those waters that tourists now sail across on cruise ships, taking photographs of the whitewashed buildings on the cliff tops above, is a volcanic landscape in miniature, with hydrothermal vents and geological structures that speak to the continuing activity of the system beneath. The eruption of 1600 BCE is not the last eruption Thera has experienced. It will not be the last. The island exists in a state of geological ongoingness that it is easy to forget when you're looking at its postcard beauty, but the archaeologists who work there remember, because the ash layers in their trenches remind them, and because the sea that laps against the cliffs is the same sea that, one morning 3,500 years ago, came rushing in to fill the space where a mountain had been, the sea that swallowed Minoan Thera and that has been slowly reclaiming Baia and Alexandria, is not only a geological force and an archaeological library, it has also been a battlefield, arguably the most contested battlefield in human history, the place where the great powers of the Mediterranean world settled their differences with oar and ram and cannon across 3,000 years of naval warfare. Of all the battles ever fought on the Mediterranean surface, only one has been called the last of its kind, the final clash of the ancient and the modern, the last time the sea was decided by men pulling oars rather than men setting sails. That battle happened on a calm October morning in 1571. On the morning of October 7th, 1571, two of the largest fleets ever assembled in the history of Mediterranean warfare faced each other at the mouth of the Gulf of Patras, off the western coast of Greece near a place called Lepanto, Naupaktos in Greek. On one side was the Ottoman fleet, commanded by Ali Pasha, flying the banner of the Sultan Selim II and carrying on its flagship's bow the green standard that had been brought from Mecca, the holiest object in the Ottoman Navy's possession, a banner said to bear the name of God written 99 times in 99 different scripts. On the other side was the Holy League fleet, assembled by Pope Pius V as a coalition of Venice, Spain, Genoa, and the Papal States, commanded by Don John of Austria, the illegitimate half-brother of King Philip II of Spain, 24 years old and on his way to becoming the most celebrated Christian commander of his generation. The two fleets were roughly matched in size. The Holy League had approximately 206 galleys and 6 large galleons called galleasses, heavy oar-powered ships that also carried substantial artillery, along with about 28,000 soldiers. The Ottomans had somewhere between 230 and 260 galleys and a smaller number of support vessels, along with roughly 34,000 fighting men. Both fleets were powered primarily by oars, because the galley, a long, narrow, low-riding vessel with banks of oars on each side, capable of rapid acceleration and tight manoeuvring in calm water, was still the dominant fighting ship of the Mediterranean, as it had been for 2,000 years. The wind conditions of the enclosed Mediterranean, with its sudden calms and unpredictable squalls, had always favoured the oar-powered vessel over the wind-dependent sailing ship, and the tacticians on both sides had spent their careers thinking in terms of oars and ramming speeds and boarding tactics that would have been entirely familiar to an admiral of classical Athens. But there were differences too. The Holy League galleys had been fitted with artillery at the bow, bronze cannons of increasing size and sophistication, to a greater extent than their Ottoman counterparts. The galleasses that Don John positioned at the front of his line were essentially floating gun platforms, enormously heavy and slow to manoeuvre, but capable of delivering devastating fire at ranges that oar-powered galleys couldn't easily counter. And crucially, Don John's fleet included a significant number of arquebus-armed soldiers, early firearms, alongside the traditional crossbow and pike-armed troops. The Ottoman forces were formidable archers, among the finest in the world, but the arrow versus bullet equation was beginning in 1571 to tip. The battle lasted approximately 4 hours, and it was an almost incomprehensible experience for the men who fought in it. The Mediterranean was calm that morning, which favoured the oared ships, and the two fleets approached each other at rowing speed, the drummers beating time, the commanders making last-minute adjustments to the line. Don John ordered the rams, the metal-tipped prows traditionally used to hole enemy ships, cut from his galleys, a decision that said clearly he intended to fight primarily by boarding and gunfire rather than ramming. The galleasses fired first, at extreme range, their heavy guns disabling several Ottoman ships and disrupting the Ottoman formation before contact was made. When the two lines met, the fighting was immediate and overwhelming in its violence. The galleys were designed to close with the enemy and grapple, to become essentially floating platforms for hand-to-hand combat, and the men who fought on them, the soldiers and the galley slaves, some of whom were freed and given weapons by the Holy League specifically to increase their fighting numbers, were in contact with the enemy within arm's reach, with no distance to soften the reality of what they were doing. A contemporary account describes the water turning red across a significant area of the battle, and this is not mere rhetoric. With 60,000 men engaged in close combat on wooden ships, the casualties were extraordinary. The battle ended in a decisive Holy League victory. Ali Pasha was killed. His head was displayed on a pike on Don John's flagship, which was a customary brutal formality of the period, and the Ottoman fleet lost approximately 200 vessels captured or sunk. Somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 Ottoman fighting men were killed or captured. The Holy League also took heavy losses, perhaps 8,000 dead and many more wounded. The engagement freed approximately 12,000 Christian galley slaves from Ottoman vessels, men who had been chained to their oars, sometimes for years, and who were liberated in the chaos of the battle and its aftermath. Among the wounded on the Holy League side was a Spanish soldier named Miguel de Cervantes, who was serving on a galley called the Marquesa. He was shot 3 times during the fighting, twice in the chest and once in the left hand, which left that hand permanently damaged. He later referred to the injury with the specific pride of a man who considered it his best credential. He called Lepanto the most noble and memorable event that past centuries have seen, or that future centuries can hope to see. And he called his wound the most beautiful thing he had ever possessed, because it was taken in the greatest battle of his age. He would go on to write Don Quixote, which is arguably the first modern novel, composed with his right hand, the one the battle had left him, the damaged left hand, a permanent reminder of the day that made him who he was. The ships that sank at Lepanto lie in the waters of the Gulf of Patras, some of them in depths that make excavation genuinely difficult but not impossible. Greek and international archaeological teams have been surveying the area for decades, and several wreck sites have been identified that are consistent with vessels from the battle. The Gulf of Patras is not an ideal environment for preservation. Its currents and sedimentation patterns are complex, but enough has survived to confirm what the historical record describes and to add details that no written account captured. Cannons, anchors, amphorae that were carrying the supplies these ships needed for a campaign that many of those who set out on it did not survive. Lepanto has a footnote in Ottoman history that is rarely told in Western accounts of the battle. The Ottoman Empire lost its fleet at Lepanto, but it did not lose its naval power. Within a year, the Ottoman shipyards at Istanbul had built an entirely new fleet, approximately 250 vessels, drawing on the empire's enormous resources of timber, iron, and skilled labour. The Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, is said to have told the Venetian ambassador that the loss at Lepanto had merely shaved the empire's beard, and that the beard would grow back while the Venetians had lost a limb. Cyprus, which the Ottomans had conquered just before Lepanto, and a limb, unlike a beard, would not regrow. He was largely correct. The Holy League dissolved almost immediately after the battle due to conflicting interests among its members, and Venice eventually signed a peace treaty with the Ottomans that ratified the loss of Cyprus. Lepanto was a decisive tactical victory for the Holy League, and a strategic situation that the Ottomans largely survived. What it did end, definitively, was the Ottoman aura of Mediterranean naval invincibility. The empire that had taken Constantinople, that had swept through the eastern Mediterranean, that had made the sea feel like Ottoman property, that empire could be beaten, and the men who had beaten it knew it, and so did everyone else. Lepanto marked the end of the galley age, the last time the oar-driven warship determined the fate of the Mediterranean. But long before the galleys came the merchants, and it is the merchants who left the most abundant physical record in the sea. While the battle fleets fought and sank and were mourned and remembered, the trading ships sank quietly, unremarked, unheroic, and in their quiet sinking preserved a record of the economic life of the ancient world that no battle fleet ever could. The wine ships of Rome were not carrying history. They were making it, in the incremental, unglamorous way that trade always makes history, and the Mediterranean floor is their archive. The Mediterranean floor is scattered with amphorae the way a forest floor is scattered with leaves, so numerous that for much of the early history of underwater archaeology, sport divers and fishermen regarded them as common nuisances, interesting to look at but essentially endless. And they are essentially endless. The Romans, who were the great industrialists of the ancient world, produced wine in quantities that modern researchers have difficulty fully comprehending. The ancient sources give us clues. Cicero mentions that a single estate in the Campania region could produce thousands of amphorae annually. Transport vessels carrying wine from Italian producers to markets in Gaul, modern France, Iberia, modern Spain and Portugal, and North Africa have been found in their dozens along ancient trade routes, and the picture they collectively paint is of an agricultural commercial system operating at a scale we tend to associate with industrial rather than ancient production. The key wine-producing regions of Roman Italy were the Tyrrhenian coast, particularly the areas around modern Naples and Pompeii, which we know from the famous villa estates around Vesuvius, and the Adriatic coast, and the islands of Sicily and Sardinia. Roman wine was produced in 3 grades: The year's finest wines, which were aged and expensive and drunk by the wealthy in carefully diluted mixtures, and a middle grade for ordinary consumption, and a lower grade called posca, which was essentially vinegar diluted with water and was the standard drink of Roman soldiers, mentioned in the Gospels when the soldiers at the crucifixion offer the dying Jesus a sponge soaked in it. The Romans drank wine instead of water, the way modern people in certain cultures drink tea instead of water, because the water was often contaminated and the fermentation process made wine safer, and also because they simply liked it. One of the most illuminating underwater finds relating to Roman wine trade was made along the route between Italy and the southern coast of France. A ship known as the Grand Conglou wreck, found off the coast of Marseille in the 1950s by Jacques Cousteau in one of his earliest archaeological diving operations, was carrying thousands of amphorae when it sank. Cousteau's excavation methods were, by modern standards, quite rough. He and his team essentially vacuumed the site with an underwater suction device that moved enormous quantities of material quickly, but destroyed much of the archaeological context in the process. But the sheer quantity of what was found told a story about the scale of Roman wine export that was strikingly new. The study of amphorae has become, in the hands of archaeologists like Emile Benoit and later scholars, a remarkably precise science. The shape, clay composition, and stamps on amphora. Producers often mark their vessels with stamps that have been found both on the amphorae themselves and in the production records at their estates on land, allow researchers to trace not just what was in a given ship, but where the cargo was produced, when, by whom, and sometimes for which market it was destined. The stamps are the ancient world's equivalent of supply chain documentation. They tell us that wine from Campania was reaching southern France regularly from the 2nd century BCE onward, that the trade intensified dramatically in the late Republic and early Empire, and that it declined in the 2nd century CE as Gaul and Iberia developed their own wine industries and stopped needing Italian imports. The amphora distribution on the Mediterranean seafloor mirrors this chronology with considerable precision. But the Roman presence in the Mediterranean isn't only about what sank. It's also about what was built beneath the water deliberately, the infrastructure of empire that extended even into the sea. At Caesarea Maritima, on the Israeli coast, the great harbour built by Herod the Great between 22 and 10 BCE stands as perhaps the most technologically ambitious building project of the ancient world. Herod, who's remembered primarily through the New Testament, where he appears as the king who ordered the massacre of infants in an attempt to kill the infant Jesus, though the historicity of this event is disputed, was an extraordinary builder. He rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem on a scale that left even his Roman overlords impressed. He built fortresses and palaces at Masada, at Herodium, at Jericho, and at Caesarea he built a harbour. The problem with Caesarea was that it had no natural harbour at all, just an exposed stretch of coastline, with no bay, no inlet, no protection from the sea. Herod's engineers solved this problem by pouring concrete into the sea. Roman hydraulic concrete made with a volcanic ash called pozzolana, mixed with lime and seawater, had the remarkable property of hardening even when submerged. In fact, modern research has shown that it gets stronger when wet, because minerals from the seawater react with the volcanic ash to form new crystalline structures that increase the concrete strength over time. Herod's builders used this material to construct two massive breakwaters extending from the shore in a curved embrace, enclosing a harbour of approximately 100,000 square metres, large enough to shelter a significant fleet. The outer breakwaters were built on a foundation of enormous concrete blocks, poured in wooden forms that were floated out to the right position and then sunk, the concrete setting in place underwater. The harbour at Caesarea functioned for centuries as one of the major ports of the eastern Mediterranean. It was the principal port of Roman Judea, the city through which Paul the Apostle travelled on his way to Rome, where the Roman governors of the province had their seat. It was the city where the First Jewish-Roman War began, in 66 CE, when a conflict between Greek and Jewish residents escalated into a massacre, and then a full rebellion that ended with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the Great Diaspora. Through all of it, the harbour Herod built kept functioning, the ships kept coming, the concrete kept strengthening in the seawater. Eventually the harbour failed. The combination of sedimentation, earthquake damage, a major earthquake struck the region in 749 CE, and the eventual decline of the city as a commercial centre led to the harbour's abandonment. The breakwaters subsided into the sea. Today, the remains of Caesarea Maritima's harbour lie in depths of 1 to 8 metres, and the underwater archaeological park created at the site allows divers and snorkelers to move through the concrete remains of one of the ancient world's greatest engineering achievements. The warehouses that line the harbour, the column bases of the lighthouse, the channels cut into the seafloor for harbour maintenance, all still there, still organised, still communicating their original purpose to anyone willing to look. There is a cruel irony at the heart of Phoenician history. The Phoenicians were the greatest maritime traders and navigators of the ancient world for perhaps 1,000 years. They sailed to Britain for tin. They circumnavigated Africa, if Herodotus's account can be credited, and the debate over whether it can has continued for 2,500 years. They founded colonies from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. Utica in Tunisia, Gadir in Spain, which became Cadiz, Leptis Magna in Libya, and dozens of smaller settlements on the coasts of every island and peninsula in the Western Sea. They gave the world the alphabet, the consonantal writing system from which Greek, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and through them virtually every modern alphabetic script descends. They manufactured and traded the famous Tyrian purple dye, made from the glands of sea snails of the genus Murex, that was so expensive it became the colour of royalty across the ancient world. The word purple in connection with imperial power comes directly from the Phoenician dye trade, and yet we know almost nothing about them from their own perspective. Almost none of their literature survives. Their archives, their histories, their religious texts, gone. We know the Phoenicians primarily through other people's accounts of them. Greek writers who were sometimes their admirers and sometimes their commercial rivals. Roman writers who had absorbed some of their culture through Carthage before destroying that city. Hebrew writers of the Old Testament who mention them as neighbours and trading partners and sometimes as religious competitors. The Phoenicians themselves are largely silent, which is the ultimate irony for a people who invented the tool, the alphabet, that the entire literate world uses to speak. The sea remembers them better than the land does. Phoenician shipwrecks have been found at various points across the Mediterranean, and they are teaching us things about Phoenician trade and navigation that no surviving text ever could. Two particularly important wrecks were found in deep water off the Ashkelon coast in Israel in 1999 by Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who found the Titanic using remotely operated vehicles, in depths of approximately 400 metres. At those depths below the oxygen minimum zone, organic preservation is exceptional, and the two ships, dated to roughly the 8th century BCE, which makes them among the oldest Phoenician wrecks ever found, had preserved wooden hulls, rope, and organic cargo that would have been completely lost in shallower water. The cargo was predominantly wine amphorae, hundreds of them, bearing a style and clay composition consistent with Phoenician production from the Levantine coast. The ships appear to have been caught by a storm and lost somewhere on the Phoenician sea lanes that connected the Levantine ports with the western Mediterranean. They went down in water too deep for ancient salvage, too deep for the fishermen's nets to reach, too deep for the coastal sedimentation and biological processes that destroy material in shallower water. And so they sat, for 2,500 years, in near-perfect preservation, waiting for sonar, technology, and remotely operated vehicles to find them. The Phoenician city of Tyre itself, the mother city from which Carthage was founded, the city from which Hiram sent cedar wood to Solomon for the construction of the temple, the city that Alexander the Great besieged for 7 months, and then destroyed in a fury when it refused to surrender. Tyre is now the Lebanese city of Sur, and the ancient harbours of this most famous of maritime cities lie partially submerged. The northern harbour and portions of the ancient city have been reclaimed by the sea over centuries of coastal change, and what survives underwater of one of the great port cities of the ancient world is only beginning to be properly studied. Sidon, the other great Phoenician city, is in better shape on land but has similarly complex underwater remains where the ancient harbours once operated. In both cities, the challenge of underwater archaeology is compounded by the political complexity of modern Lebanon and the ongoing security situation that has made sustained international archaeological work difficult. The Phoenician coast, which should be one of the richest archaeological landscapes in the Mediterranean, remains relatively understudied compared to sites in Italy, Greece, and Egypt, and the underwater component even more so. What has been found at Tyre, at Sidon, at Byblos further north, at the Phoenician colonial sites across the Mediterranean, reveals a maritime people who are not simply merchants, but who are also engineers, artists, craftsmen, and navigators of extraordinary competence. The ships they built were different in design from the Greek and Roman vessels that came later. Broader, higher-sided, designed for cargo capacity rather than military speed. The Phoenicians were not primarily a naval power in the military sense. They usually fought for whoever was paying them, as mercenaries in the fleets of Egypt, Persia, and eventually Rome, but as cargo carriers and explorers. Their ships were the best in the ancient world for much of the first millennium BCE. There is one Phoenician story that deserves to be told fully, because it sits at the intersection of what we know and what we can only guess at, and because its implications, if true, are staggering. Around 600 BCE, according to Herodotus, the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II hired Phoenician sailors to attempt the circumnavigation of Africa. The sailors departed from the Red Sea, sailed south and west around the continent, and returned through the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, to the Mediterranean, completing the journey in approximately 3 years. Herodotus himself finds one detail of their account suspicious. The sailors reported that as they sailed around the southern tip of Africa, the sun was on their right, that is to the north, rather than to their left as it was throughout their Mediterranean and Red Sea experience. Herodotus notes this as something he doesn't believe, which is almost certainly why it is almost certainly true. Someone who didn't understand that the sun appears in the northern sky when you are south of the equator could not have invented that detail. If the Phoenicians really did circumnavigate Africa, they did so roughly 2,000 years before Vasco da Gama, who accomplished the same feat in 1498 CE and is credited in Western histories as the first to do so. The eastern Mediterranean coast is, in many ways, the most archaeologically layered region on Earth. Civilizations have been building on these shores, one on top of another, for so long that the accumulated depth of human habitation in some areas is measured in dozens of meters of occupation debris. Pottery shards, building stones, bones, ash, seeds, tools, all compressed by the weight of time into a dense historical record that archaeologists call a tell. But the land-based archaeology, for all its richness, tells only part of the story. The coast itself has changed. Harbours have silted up or subsided. Cities that once stood at the water's edge are now underwater. Cities that once had their harbours exposed to the open sea are now buried under later harbours. The interface between land and water in the ancient eastern Mediterranean is not where it was, and what lies on the other side of that shifted boundary is extraordinary. The Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete left behind perhaps the most architecturally sophisticated and artistically accomplished culture of the pre-classical Aegean world. The palace at Knossos, excavated by Arthur Evans beginning in 1900, the same year the Antikythera wreck was found, as it happens, which makes 1900 a particularly significant year in Mediterranean archaeology, is a structure of labyrinthine complexity, with multiple stories, plumbing, drainage, storage magazines of enormous capacity, and frescoed walls that show dolphins, bulls, griffins, and the enigmatic bull-leaping figures that have become the visual signature of Minoan culture. The palace functioned as a combined administrative centre, religious site, and redistribution hub, collecting agricultural produce from across Crete and distributing it to the population, a system that required bureaucratic record-keeping and produced the Linear A script, which remains undeciphered. But the Minoan world extended beyond Crete. Minoan settlements and cultural influence have been traced to islands across the Aegean, and the underwater sites associated with Minoan civilization offer tantalizing evidence of a maritime culture that was more extensive than the land-based evidence alone suggests. At the island of Thera, off the northeastern coast of Crete, an ancient harbour settlement has been studied both on land and underwater, revealing a community that lived by trade and fishing and maintained connections with the broader Minoan world through regular sea traffic. The harbour area of Thera, now partially submerged, includes remains of the quays and harbour structures that served this community, along with evidence of the goods that moved through it. The underwater site of Pavlopetri, off the southern coast of Laconia in Greece, is unique in the Mediterranean. It is an entire submerged prehistoric town, dating from roughly 2800 to 1100 BCE, that lies in shallow water just offshore and has been mapped with extraordinary precision using modern surveying techniques. The town has streets, courtyards, building foundations, pithos storage jars still in situ, and evidence of a community that functioned through the Bronze Age and was eventually abandoned, for reasons unknown, as the sea level rose and the land subsided to put it permanently underwater. This site is one of the oldest submerged urban settlements in the world, and the three-dimensional maps that have been made of it, using computer modelling and underwater survey data, reveal a town that would not look out of place in a modern archaeological site plan. Organised, planned, with clearly demarcated domestic and communal spaces. Moving eastward along the coast, the site of Atlit Yam off the Israeli coast represents something even older, and perhaps more haunting. Atlit Yam is a Neolithic settlement, dating from approximately 7000 to 6000 BCE, that lies 8 to 12 metres underwater on the continental shelf. It preserves a stone-built village with the remains of structures, stone-lined wells, ritual arrangements, and most remarkably a semicircle of 7 large megaliths, standing stones arranged in a pattern around a freshwater spring that was clearly a ritual or communal focus for the people who built it. Human skeletons have been recovered from Atlit Yam. An analysis of the skeletal remains has revealed the oldest known cases of tuberculosis in the archaeological record, preserved in the bones of individuals who died 9,000 years ago. At the time Atlit Yam was built and occupied, the Mediterranean Sea level was lower than it is today, considerably lower. The people who lived there were not living at the edge of the sea, they were living inland near a spring, in a forested landscape that extended to a coast that was several kilometres from their village. The sea came gradually, as global sea levels rose after the last ice age, and the community either moved away from its original location or was eventually abandoned as the encroaching water made it untenable. The stone circle and the wells and the houses were not buried by catastrophe, but by the slow, irresistible rise of the sea, a process that took centuries and that the inhabitants, over many generations, probably experienced as a gradual narrowing of their familiar landscape. This is one of the things that underwater Mediterranean archaeology keeps confronting. The evidence that the coastline we think of as natural and permanent is in fact relatively recent and in constant, if slow, motion. Sea levels across the Mediterranean have risen by perhaps 120 metres since the peak of the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, and the coastal shelf areas that are now submerged were once dry land on which people lived, built, farmed, and buried their dead. The archaeology of the submerged shelf is essentially the archaeology of lost coastlines, of human habitation that predates the current configuration of land and sea, and it is only beginning to be seriously explored. In the Adriatic, where the sea is relatively shallow and the coastline has changed significantly since the Bronze Age, ancient sites have been found at multiple locations. The ancient city of Epidamnos, which became the Roman city of Dyrrhachium and is now the Albanian city of Durrës, had a harbour that extended further into the sea than its modern equivalent, and the remains of ancient quays and harbour structures lie in the shallow water offshore. The site of Solin in Croatia, the ancient Salona, which was the capital of the Roman province of Dalmatia, and one of the largest cities in the Western Balkans during the imperial period, has underwater components in the harbour area that have been studied, and that add to the picture of a major provincial city that we know primarily from its extensive land-based remains. In 1530, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V gave the island of Malta to the Knights Hospitaller, a military religious order founded during the Crusades to care for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem, which had gradually become one of the most formidable military organisations in the medieval and early modern world. The gift came with conditions. The knights were to defend the island and the surrounding seas against Ottoman expansion, and they were to pay the symbolic annual rent of a single falcon. This arrangement produced the famous Maltese falcon, an object that gave its name to a detective novel and a film, and became a cultural touchstone in ways that its creators could not have anticipated. More importantly, it established Malta as the Western Mediterranean's front line in the conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the Christian powers of Europe. The knights had been expelled from their previous base at Rhodes in 1522 after a siege by Suleiman the Magnificent that lasted from July to December and ended with a negotiated surrender that Suleiman honoured with unusual generosity. He allowed the knights to leave with their weapons and their dignity intact, a decision that his advisers apparently considered too lenient, and that history would eventually judge as a strategic error. At Malta, which was smaller and less naturally defensible than Rhodes, but strategically positioned between Sicily and North Africa at the narrowest point of the central Mediterranean, the knights spent the following decades building fortifications and rebuilding their military capacity. The test came in 1565. The Ottoman fleet, the largest single military fleet ever assembled in the Mediterranean to that point, carrying somewhere between 30,000 and 48,000 men, including crack Janissary infantry, arrived off Malta in May and began what became known as the Great Siege of Malta. The knights, under their Grand Master Jean Perceau de Valette, had approximately 600 knight brothers, around 7,000 to 9,000 Maltese soldiers and militia, and a population of civilians sheltering within the fortifications. The odds were, by any conventional military calculation, absurd. The siege lasted from May 18th to September 8th, 1565, almost 4 months of continuous combat in the brutal heat of a Mediterranean summer. The Ottomans focused their initial attacks on the fortress of St. Elmo, which guarded the entrance to the harbour. The defenders of St. Elmo, who numbered around 1,500 at the beginning, held it for more than a month against an attacking force many times their size, inflicting casualties that the Ottoman commander Mustafa Pasha had not expected and could not afford. When St. Elmo finally fell, on June 23rd, virtually every defender was dead. Mustafa Pasha, furious at the cost of taking what he had expected to be a minor fortification, ordered the bodies of the fallen knights mutilated and floated across the harbour on crosses, a gesture intended to demoralise the remaining defenders. De Valette responded by executing all Ottoman prisoners and firing their heads from his cannons, a counter-gesture that established, in the clearest possible terms, what kind of siege this was going to be. The defence of the remaining fortifications, the Birgu and the Senglea, which together formed the area now called the Three Cities, across the harbour from the modern Valletta, was one of the most intense episodes of early modern warfare. The Ottomans launched repeated massive assaults. De Valette, in his 70s and fighting alongside his men on the walls, was wounded but refused to leave. A crucial moment came in August when Ottoman forces managed to plant their banner briefly on the walls of the Sengleia, and it seemed that the defences must break. They didn't. The Ottoman assault was repulsed, and in early September a Spanish relief force finally arrived from Sicily, and the Ottomans, exhausted and decimated, withdrew. The Great Siege of Malta is less famous in the English-speaking world than it deserves to be, partly because England was not involved, and partly because the history of the early modern Mediterranean is less taught in Anglophone schools than the history of the same period in Northern Europe. But contemporaries understood its significance immediately. When the news reached Rome, the Pope ordered celebrations. When it reached Vienna, it was greeted with relief that may have been greater than at any subsequent event before the later defeat of the Ottoman fleet at Lepanto 6 years later. The Siege of Malta represented the high watermark of Ottoman westward expansion. After 1565, the Ottomans never again seriously threatened the western Mediterranean, and while their power in the eastern basin continued for centuries, the vision of a Mediterranean-wide Ottoman dominance, which had seemed plausible in the decades when Ottoman armies were at the gates of Vienna and Ottoman fleets were raiding the Italian coast, began to recede. The waters around Malta hold extraordinary quantities of historical material from the siege and from the subsequent centuries of the Knights' rule over the island. The Grand Harbour of Malta, now one of the most recognisable harbour landscapes in the world, with the golden stone fortifications of Valletta and the 3 cities framing water that changes colour through the day from turquoise to steel blue, was the site of some of the most intense naval activity in the early modern Mediterranean. Ottoman ships sunk in the harbour approaches, hospitaller galleys that went down in the fighting, material thrown into the harbour during the siege and its aftermath. All of this lies in the relatively shallow and well-studied waters of one of the Mediterranean's finest natural harbours. The Vinacourt aqueduct that the Knights built to supply fresh water to Malta, the fortifications they constructed along the coastline, the churches and palaces they built in Valletta, which they founded, specifically as a new capital after the siege, naming it after de Valette, who died in 1568 before it was completed. All of these remain above water, one of the finest concentrations of Baroque architecture and early modern fortification engineering in the world. But the harbour and the coastal waters hold additional layers: Roman and Phoenician anchors, medieval pottery, early modern cannonballs and ballast, the traces of a sea that was never quiet, never simply empty, in all the centuries when Malta was the hinge on which the Mediterranean's power struggles turned. The history of Mediterranean underwater archaeology divides neatly, if somewhat roughly, into 2 eras: everything before the sonar survey and the remotely operated vehicle, and everything after. The first era, which ran from the accidental discovery of the Antikythera wreck in 1900 through the pioneering work of Jacques Cousteau and George Bass and the development of sports diving, was extraordinary in what it achieved, but it was fundamentally limited by the depth of water a human diver could safely work in. The recreational diving limit is generally placed at around 40 metres. Professional and mixed gas diving can extend this to perhaps 60 or 70 metres for experienced practitioners working specific sites. Below that, without specialised equipment that was simply not available for most of the 20th century, the deep Mediterranean was as inaccessible as the surface of another planet. That changed. The development of remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, capable of diving to thousands of metres, equipped with cameras, sample collection arms and sonar mapping systems originally developed for the petroleum industry, opened the deep Mediterranean floor to exploration for the first time. Robert Ballard, who found the Titanic in 1985 using exactly this technology, turned his attention to the Mediterranean with results that transformed the field. His surveys of the deep water between Turkey and Israel found Phoenician wrecks at 400 metres. His surveys of the Black Sea found evidence of a landscape that was once dry land, with preserved organic material, including what appeared to be ancient structures in the oxygen-poor waters of that unique landlocked sea. The deep Mediterranean has characteristics that make it, in some ways, a better preserving environment than shallow water. Below the oxygenated surface layer, biological processes slow dramatically. The wood-boring mollusks that can destroy a wooden ship's hull in years at shallow depths do not survive at great depth. The currents that disturb and scatter shallow water sites are absent on the deep floor. Ships that sank to the deep have, in many cases, landed more or less intact and remained undisturbed for centuries or millennia. The amphorae are still stacked as they were in the hold. The anchor chains are still laid out. The personal objects of the crew are still in the places where they were dropped. The survey work that Ballard and others pioneered has been continued and extended by programs like the European Union's BlueMed initiative, by national archaeological agencies across the Mediterranean rim, and by academic institutions with access to advanced survey technology. The results, across 2 decades of deep-water survey, have been both confirming and astonishing. Confirming, because many of the wrecks found in deep water are exactly what historical models predicted would be there. Merchant ships following known trade routes, carrying known cargo types, sinking at rates consistent with ancient maritime casualty statistics. Astonishing, because every few years something turns up that nobody predicted. One of the most significant ongoing discoveries is the sheer density of ancient wrecks in certain areas of the deep Mediterranean. The shipping lanes between Italy and North Africa, between Greece and Egypt, between the Levantine coast and the western Mediterranean, these corridors are littered with wrecks. The exact number of ancient wrecks in the Mediterranean has been estimated by various researchers at somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000. And while the upper figure is probably optimistic, even the lower figure represents a resource so vast that it would take centuries of systematic excavation to fully address. We have seriously investigated a few hundred of them. The technology continues to improve. Autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, can now survey the seafloor using multi-beam sonar and photogrammetry without a human operator guiding them in real time, covering large areas of seafloor systematically and producing detailed 3-dimensional maps of everything they find. Machine learning systems are being developed to analyze the resulting data and identify anomalies, shapes that might be wrecks, patterns that might indicate ancient habitation, from among the enormous quantities of seafloor imagery that modern survey generates. DNA, analysis of ancient organic material recovered from wrecks and submerged sites, is providing information about the genetics of ancient populations, the origins of cargo, and the biology of species that no longer exist in their original ranges. Isotopic analysis of metals and pottery is tracing trade goods to their points of origin with increasing precision. The tools are better than they have ever been, and they are improving every year. In 2019 and 2020, new excavation at the Antikythera wreck site, using cutting-edge diving equipment and underwater survey technology, recovered additional artifacts including bronze items that may be parts of additional mechanical devices, not necessarily identical to the mechanism, but constructed objects of the kind that only a sophisticated technological culture would produce. The analysis of these items continues, the excavation continues. The wreck site, which has been producing extraordinary finds for 120 years, apparently has more to say. At Pavlopetri, the submerged Bronze Age town off the coast of Laconia, collaboration between the British School at Athens and Greek archaeologists using advanced photogrammetric techniques has produced the most detailed 3-dimensional model of the site ever made, revealing structures and spatial relationships that were invisible to earlier survey methods. Buildings that were identified as single large structures have been shown to be multiple smaller buildings. The overall extent of the settlement appears to be larger than previously estimated. The model has allowed researchers to begin reconstructing what life in this town might have looked like, where people stored food, where they conducted communal activities, how the urban space was organized and used, in ways that add human texture to what might otherwise be just a collection of stone foundations. New survey work in the waters around Sicily, historically one of the most contested and most travelled areas of the Mediterranean, the island over which Greeks and Phoenicians and Carthaginians and Romans all fought for centuries, is revealing wreck concentrations that reflect every major period of Sicilian history, from the Bronze Age through the early modern period. The waters around the Agadi Islands, off Sicily's western tip, were the site of the Battle of the Agadi Islands in 241 BCE, the final naval battle of the First Punic War, in which the Roman fleet under Gaius Lutatius Catulus destroyed the Carthaginian relief fleet and forced Carthage to accept peace terms that ended the First Punic War. The bronze rams from Roman and Carthaginian ships have been found on the seafloor, some still bearing Latin inscriptions that are the oldest Latin inscriptions found in any context, recovered from a battle that changed the political geography of the Western Mediterranean. Each recovered artifact raises as many questions as it answers. The bronze rams from the Agadi battlefield tell us where ships fought and sank, but not the names of the crews, not what they were thinking as the battle turned against them, not how long it took for the last sailors to go under. The amphorae tell us what was traded, but not the conversations of the merchants who traded it, the arguments over price, the celebrations when a cargo arrived safely. The mechanism tells us that someone built it, but not their name, not what they said when they first showed it to someone else, not whether they knew how extraordinary it was. The Mediterranean is full of these silences. It is a sea that has absorbed so much human life, so much ambition and fear and hope and violence and commerce and curiosity, and what it gives back is always partial, always fragmentary, always requiring interpretation. The archaeologist's job, and the historians and perhaps the storytellers, is to hold those fragments up to the light and try to understand what they were part of, to reconstruct the shape of the whole from pieces that are never quite enough, to hear in the silence the echo of everything that hasn't survived. The Black Sea is not technically part of the Mediterranean. It is connected to it through the Bosphorus, the Sea of Marmara, and the Dardanelles, three narrow straits that have been among the most strategically important waterways in history, the control of which has determined the fate of empires from the ancient Greeks, through the Byzantine emperors, through the Ottoman sultans, through the competing powers of the 20th century. But the Black Sea is so intimately connected to Mediterranean history, so thoroughly woven into the same network of trade, migration, and military conflict, that any serious account of what the Mediterranean holds must venture, if only briefly, into its waters. The Black Sea is unique among the world's large bodies of water in being almost entirely anoxic below a depth of approximately 150 to 200 meters. The surface layer is oxygenated by wind mixing and photosynthesis, but below the halocline, the boundary between the fresher, lighter surface water fed by rivers and the denser, saltier water that entered from the Mediterranean thousands of years ago, there is essentially no oxygen, no biological activity, no bacteria or worms or organisms of any kind capable of decomposing organic matter. A ship that sinks below the halocline in the Black Sea does not rot, its wood does not decay, its rigging does not fall apart, its organic cargo, the grain, the wine, the sailors' personal effects, is preserved in conditions approaching those of a freezer. This was demonstrated dramatically by Robert Ballard's Black Sea expeditions in 1999 and subsequent years, which found ancient wrecks at depths between 100 and 2,000 meters in states of preservation that stunned the archaeological world. One wreck, dating to roughly the Byzantine period, perhaps the 9th or 10th century CE, was found at 320 meters with its hull almost entirely intact, its mast still standing, its rigging still in place, its cargo still stacked in the hold, as if the ship had simply come to rest on the sea floor and decided to stay. The preservation was so complete that the individual strands of rope were still distinguishable. This is not the kind of preservation that Mediterranean archaeologists are used to working with. It represents a fundamentally different order of physical evidence. The Greek colonies around the Black Sea coast were among the most important in the ancient Greek world. Olbia, in what is now Ukraine, was a major trading centre for grain and slaves, two of the ancient world's most important commodities. Trapezus, the modern Turkish city of Trabzon, was a staging post for trade routes into the Caucasus and Central Asia. Pantikapaeum, the capital of the Bosporan kingdom on the Crimean Peninsula, was for centuries one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient Greek world, supported by the enormous agricultural productivity of the Pontic steppe and the trade in grain that fed Athens and the rest of the Greek world during the classical period. When Athens lost access to Black Sea grain in the early 4th century BCE, the city came close to starvation, which gives some measure of how dependent the Mediterranean world was on the supply chain that ran through the Bosphorus. The relationship between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea goes back further than the Greeks. There is a hypothesis, controversial but supported by considerable geological evidence, that the Black Sea as we know it, with its present water level and its connection to the Mediterranean, was formed by a catastrophic flood event somewhere around 5600 BCE, when the rising Mediterranean, held back for millennia by a natural dam at the Bosphorus, finally broke through and flooded a much smaller, much fresher lake basin. The Black Sea researchers William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed, in their 1997 book Noah's Flood, that this event was the origin of the flood narratives found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and, through it, the biblical story of Noah. The people living around the shores of the pre-flood Black Sea basin experienced a catastrophic inundation that drove them into the surrounding regions and imprinted itself so deeply on collective memory that echoes of it survived in the mythological traditions of half a dozen cultures. The idea is attractive, and the geological evidence for the flood itself, the sediment layers, the submerged ancient shorelines, the biological evidence of the transition from freshwater to saltwater species, is solid. Whether the cultural connection to flood mythology is as direct as Ryan and Pittman proposed is more uncertain, and the hypothesis has been both embraced and criticised by scholars in equal measure. But the submerged landscape of the pre-flood Black Sea basin is real, and there is evidence of human habitation on what is now the seafloor, structures, possibly, fireplaces, the traces of a world that was literally drowned when the sea came in. Whether anyone was there to witness it, and whether the memory of the witnessing persisted across 7,000 years of cultural transmission, remains one of the genuinely open questions at the intersection of archaeology, geology and mythology. The Black Sea and its drowned prehistory remind us that the Mediterranean world was always larger than its shores, that the sea connected to other seas, to other histories, to civilizations whose relationship with the Mediterranean shaped everything that happened within it. Of all the civilizations that came to the Mediterranean from outside, none transformed it more thoroughly than the one that arrived from the Anatolian steppe in the 13th and 14th centuries and spent the next 300 years making the sea its own. To understand how the Ottoman Empire became a Mediterranean power, you have to begin in a place that has no coastline, the Anatolian steppe. The early Ottomans were pastoral warriors, a small Turkic principality among many competing for the fragmented remnants of the Seljuk world. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, they were land people. Their advantage was not ships, but horses and discipline, and a remarkable ability to absorb the skills and populations of the peoples they conquered. When Osman I founded the dynasty that would bear his name, the sea was not yet part of his world. His horizon was the Byzantine frontier, the walls of the old Greek cities on the Anatolian coast, the fertile river valleys that would feed an expanding state. But the sea came to the Ottomans almost immediately when they began taking coastal cities. When they captured Bursa in 1326 and moved their capital there, they were still inland. When they crossed into Europe at Gallipoli in 1354, the first Ottoman foothold on the European side of the Bosphorus, they used boats that were rented or captured, not their own fleet. The naval tradition they would eventually develop came largely from the seafaring peoples they absorbed. The Turkish maritime communities of the Aegean coast, former Byzantine and Genoese sailors who entered Ottoman service, Greek Christian sailors who found the Ottoman administrative system more tolerant or more profitable than their alternatives, and the Barbary corsairs of North Africa, who eventually accepted loose Ottoman suzerainty and provided the empire with some of its most formidable naval commanders. The most important single event in Ottoman naval history, and arguably in Mediterranean history more broadly, was the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Muhammad II, who would be called the Conqueror, was 21 years old when he brought his army and his fleet against the walls of the city that had been the capital of the Roman Empire in its eastern form for over 1,000 years. The city's natural defences were extraordinary. The sea walls along the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn Inlet were effectively impregnable to direct assault, and the chain that stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, a massive iron barrier that prevented any ship from entering the harbour, had protected the city for centuries. Muhammad solved the Golden Horn problem in one of the most audacious logistical operations of medieval warfare. He had his ships dragged overland, on greased wooden rollers, across the ridge behind the Genoese suburb of Thera, and relaunched them inside the Golden Horn. The Byzantines, watching from the walls, could not believe what they were seeing, and by the time they had organised a response it was too late. The ships were in the harbour, the walls were being attacked from 3 sides, and on May 29th, 1453, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died in the final street fighting. His body never formally identified afterward. His empire of 1,000 years ended in a single afternoon. The fall of Constantinople sent a shock through the European world that can be compared, in some ways, to the psychological impact of September 11th, 2001. Not in the death toll, which was relatively small by the standards of medieval warfare, but in the symbolic and strategic implications. Constantinople was not just a city, it was the living continuity of the Roman Empire, the place where the Eastern Roman tradition had survived the fall of the West by a full millennium, the city where the most sophisticated scholars, artists and theologians of the Greek Christian world had continued to work and think and argue. When it fell, those scholars fled west, to Venice, to Florence, to Rome, carrying manuscripts that had been preserved in Constantinople's libraries through the long centuries, when Western European scholarship had largely lost access to classical Greek texts. The fall of Constantinople, paradoxically, helped ignite the Renaissance, because it scattered Greek learning into the hungry intellectual culture of 15th century Italy. For the Ottomans, the conquest of Constantinople opened the Mediterranean in a completely new way. The Bosphorus was now an Ottoman waterway. The Black Sea could be made an Ottoman lake. The Aegean was within reach. Over the following decades, the Ottomans built a fleet that would challenge, and sometimes surpass, the naval power of Venice, Genoa, and the other Christian maritime states. They took Greek islands one by one, Negroponte in 1470, Lepanto in 1499, Rhodes, after a long and difficult siege, as we have discussed, in 1522. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman fleet under the great Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, who had begun his career as a Barbary corsair and risen through Ottoman service to become the most feared naval commander in the Mediterranean, was raiding the coasts of Italy, Sicily, and Spain with impunity, and the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was seriously contemplating what a full Ottoman conquest of Western Europe might look like. The famous name Barbarossa, meaning Redbeard in Italian, was actually applied to 2 brothers, Aruj and Hayreddin, both sons of a Greek father and an Albanian or Turkish mother on the island of Lesbos. Aruj, the elder brother, was the first to establish himself as a corsair leader in North Africa, raiding Christian shipping from bases in Tunisia and Algeria. When Aruj was killed fighting the Spanish in 1518, Hayreddin continued his work, and he was the more remarkable commander of the 2. He placed himself under Ottoman protection, provided the Sultan with strategic access to North African bases, and used the resources and prestige of the empire to build a naval power that transformed the Western Mediterranean. At the naval battle of Preveza in 1538, Hayreddin defeated a combined Christian fleet under the Genoese admiral Andrea Doria, a defeat so complete and so embarrassing that it established Ottoman naval supremacy in the Mediterranean for a generation and demonstrated that the Christian maritime powers, for all their sophistication, could be outmaneuvered and outfought by a commander who thought differently about the sea. Hayreddin died in 1546, old and honoured and in his bed in Istanbul, a death that was not common for men who lived the lives he had lived. His tomb still stands in Istanbul, near the shore of the Bosphorus that he had done so much to make an Ottoman waterway. And the ships that sank in the waters he commanded, at Preveza, at the various engagements along the North African coast, in the Aegean passages where his galleys ran down Christian merchantmen, are slowly being found by archaeologists who are mapping the undersea landscape of the Ottoman Mediterranean. The cannons and anchors and ballast stones and personal effects of the men who crewed those galleys are coming up from the seafloor, century by century, filling in the picture of what the Mediterranean looked like in those decades when it genuinely was, in the minds of those who sailed it, an Ottoman sea. The relationship between the Ottoman Empire and the sea ultimately tells us something important about how power and geography interact in history. The Ottomans did not come from the sea, but when their expansion brought them to it, they learned its logic with extraordinary speed, and they understood, in a way that purely land-based powers often fail to, that control of the sea meant control of the trade that sustained civilization. The ports they captured, the routes they dominated, the fleets they built and lost and rebuilt, all of this was part of a strategic vision that treated the Mediterranean not as an obstacle or a border, but as a resource, a highway, a domain to be administered like any other territory. When the empire finally declined, beginning seriously in the 17th and accelerating through the 18th and 19th centuries, the decline of its naval power was both a symptom and a cause. The sea that had helped make the empire could not be held without the empire's strength, and without the sea, the empire grew weaker still. The history of Mediterranean underwater archaeology is also a history of remarkable individuals, and it would be incomplete without acknowledging some of them, not as a footnote or a catalogue, but as a recognition that the knowledge we have about what lies beneath the Mediterranean surface came to us through specific people who made specific choices, often against the advice of colleagues, and sometimes against the conventions of their disciplines, to go and look. Jacques-Yves Cousteau is the name that most people associate with underwater exploration, and his influence on the public understanding of the sea through his films, his books, his television series. The undersea world of Jacques Cousteau, which ran through the 1960s and 70s and introduced millions of people to the reality of what existed beneath the ocean surface, was transformative. But Cousteau was also a real pioneer of underwater archaeology, even if his methods were sometimes rough by later standards. His excavation of the Grand Conglou wreck in the 1950s, whatever its methodological limitations, demonstrated that systematic underwater archaeology was possible and productive, and his development and popularization of the aqualung, the self-contained diving apparatus that gave divers freedom of movement without the copper helmet and airline of the traditional hard-hat diving suit, created the entire infrastructure of sport and professional diving that made later archaeological work possible. George Bass, the American archaeologist who founded the Institute of Nautical Archaeology and led the excavation of the Uluburun wreck, represents a different model. The rigorous academic who insisted that underwater archaeology must meet the same standards of methodological precision as any other archaeological discipline, not merely recover spectacular objects but understand their context and relationships. Bass was the person who established, through sheer persistence and intellectual argument, that underwater archaeology was archaeology, that the fact of the water did not create a different discipline with different standards, but only a different set of technical challenges requiring different tools while maintaining the same commitment to systematic documentation and contextual analysis. The Uluburun excavation, with its 22,000 dives and its methodical recovery of every fragment, was the proof of that argument. Frank Godiot, who discovered the submerged royal quarter of Alexandria and continues to direct excavations there, represents another model again, the independent researcher with private funding and deep technical expertise who is willing to pursue large, ambitious projects that national archaeological services and academic institutions lack the resources or the flexibility to attempt. Godio's work at Alexandria and at the nearby site of Heracleion, the legendary harbour city mentioned in ancient texts that was thought to be mythological until Godio found it, sunken in the Bay of Abukir in the late 1990s, has revealed aspects of the ancient Egyptian world that no land-based excavation could have approached. Heracleion, also known as Thonis, is worth its own extended description. It was a real city, a major port at the mouth of the Canopic branch of the Nile, where Egyptian tradition required that all trade goods entering from the Mediterranean be first brought for inspection and taxation. It was where the young Helen of Troy and Paris stopped, according to some versions of the myth, before continuing to Troy. It was where Heracles himself was said to have first set foot in Egypt. It appears in inscriptions and papyri and the accounts of ancient writers as a significant and prosperous city. And then it disappeared, not gradually, like Alexandria's royal quarter, but apparently in a series of earthquakes and liquefaction events that caused large sections of the Nile Delta to sink, taking the city with it, sometime between the 2nd and 8th centuries CE. Godio found it in 1999 in about 6 meters of water covered by a meter or two of sediment, essentially intact in its basic layout. The city's grand temple of Amun-Gereb, one of the most important temples in all of Egypt, still stood in fragments on the seafloor, its granite columns overthrown but present. Over 500 anchors have been found in the ancient harbour, a record of centuries of international trade. More than 60 shipwrecks, 64 Osiris ritual objects of a type known as Osiris Canopus, in gold and silver and bronze, that had been placed in the temple in a specific ritual arrangement. The 16-ton granite naos, the innermost shrine of the temple, still sitting where it fell when the temple subsided. Gold jewellery, coins, inscriptions. The physical reality of a city that had been known only from text for 1,500 years, fully present, recovered, waiting. These are not isolated discoveries by exceptional individuals. They are part of a growing field that includes national underwater archaeological services in Greece, Turkey, Italy, Croatia, Israel, Egypt, Tunisia, and Spain, all conducting ongoing survey and excavation work in their respective waters. They include international collaborative projects that pool expertise and technology across national boundaries. They include citizen science initiatives that train recreational divers to report and document sites they encounter. They include the work of maritime museums across the Mediterranean rim that are preserving and displaying what is found and making it accessible to the publics whose ancestors made it. The field is not just growing, it is maturing, institutionalizing, developing the infrastructure of sustained long-term inquiry rather than dramatic individual discovery, and that is how the deepest knowledge gets built. The people who go looking, the divers and archaeologists and scholars whose work has given us everything we know about the underwater Mediterranean, work in the service of civilizations that are in many cases still badly misunderstood despite the centuries of scholarship devoted to them. We have talked about the Antikythera Mechanism, the Uluburun cargo, the drowned cities of the Bronze Age, the Roman resort towns and the Phoenician traders and the Ottoman admirals. But there is one civilization, spanning almost a full millennium of Mediterranean history, that the Western world systematically underestimates and overlooks, the empire that called itself Roman long after Rome itself had ceased to exist. There is a peculiarity in the way Western history is taught that has always struck scholars of the medieval world as slightly absurd. The fiction that the Roman Empire ended in 476 CE, when a Germanic chieftain named Doacer deposed the last emperor of the western half and sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, politely suggesting that one emperor was enough for everyone. In the standard textbook narrative, this is the fall of Rome, the end of the ancient world, the beginning of the medieval period, a clean break that allows history, teachers everywhere to say, "This is where we turn the page." But in Constantinople, nobody turned any page. The Emperor Zeno, who received Odoacer's message and its accompanying crown, simply filed it away and continued ruling. The empire continued, the army continued, the laws continued, the bureaucracy continued, the ships continued to sail. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call, somewhat condescendingly, the Byzantine Empire, a name its own citizens never used, continued for another 977 years, until the very same Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. The Byzantine Empire is one of the most underappreciated and misunderstood major civilizations in all of world history. In the popular imagination, it is either an afterthought to Rome or a footnote to the medieval period, a glittering but static civilization of mosaics and theological arguments, producing extraordinary art but not much history. This impression is entirely wrong. Byzantium fought, expanded, contracted, reformed, collapsed partially, recovered, generated intellectual movements that helped shape the Renaissance, preserved the classical texts that the West had lost, and maintained, for 1,000 years, a continuous legal and administrative tradition derived from Rome that influenced the legal systems of every European country that succeeded it. It produced military innovators, philosophical giants, skilled diplomats, extraordinary artists, and some of the most ruthless political operators in world history, all operating within a system that was, by the standards of the ancient world, a functioning state with rule of law, a professional civil service, and a surprisingly sophisticated conception of what government owed its citizens. The sea was central to Byzantine power in a way that is often underestimated. Constantinople sits on one of the most geographically extraordinary positions on Earth, at the junction of the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara, with the Golden Horn Inlet creating a natural harbour of exceptional shelter and defensibility, and with effective control over the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. A city positioned there could, if it maintained a fleet, dominate the trade of an enormous region. The grain and timber of the Black Sea, the luxury goods flowing west from the Silk Road through the ports of the Black Sea coast, the agricultural produce of Anatolia, the manufactures of the Aegean Islands. The Byzantines understood this and exploited it ruthlessly. Their navy was a professional service, not a drafted seasonal force, and it was equipped with one of the most feared weapons in the medieval arsenal: Greek fire. Greek fire was an incendiary weapon deployed from ships, either through siphon-type projectors or in ceramic grenades, that burned on water and could not be extinguished by water, which made it uniquely terrifying in naval warfare. Its composition is one of history's most closely guarded secrets. The Byzantines never wrote it down, kept knowledge of its manufacture within a very small circle of trusted specialists, and threatened severe punishment for any disclosure. Modern chemists and historians have proposed various formulations: quicklime, petroleum, sulfur, and various organic compounds in different combinations, but the exact recipe has never been definitively reconstructed. What is clear from the accounts of those who faced it is that it worked, and worked terrifyingly. The Arab fleets that twice besieged Constantinople, in 674 and again in 717, were driven off largely through its use. Russian fleets that periodically threatened the empire met the same fate. The psychological effect of fire that could not be put out, burning on the surface of the sea itself, spreading toward wooden ships and the men who crewed them, was presumably as significant as the physical destruction it caused. The Byzantine trade network, centered on Constantinople, was the most sophisticated commercial system in the medieval world for several centuries. Byzantine merchants and their agents operated across an area stretching from England to India, from Scandinavia to Ethiopia. The famous Byzantine silk industry, which maintained a state monopoly on silk production and export for centuries, was made possible by a particular act of industrial espionage in the 6th century CE, when two monks, at the direction of Emperor Justinian I, smuggled silkworm eggs out of China hidden in hollow walking staves, breaking the Chinese monopoly on silk production and establishing the Byzantine silk industry that would be one of the empire's most important economic assets for the rest of its existence. Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 CE, was perhaps the most consequential single Byzantine emperor, and his reign produced both the highest achievements and some of the most terrible episodes in Byzantine history. He reconquered North, Africa from the Vandals and Italy from the Ostrogoths, briefly reuniting the empire's western and eastern halves for the last time. He commissioned the Hagia Sophia, whose dome, the largest in the world for nearly 1,000 years, was an engineering achievement of a kind that the ancient world had never quite attempted, and the medieval world would not surpass until Brunelleschi built the dome of Florence Cathedral 9 centuries later. He codified Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, a systematic organization of legal principles and precedents that became the foundation of legal systems across Europe and is still directly relevant to civil law in dozens of countries today. And he presided over the Plague of Justinian, which struck Constantinople in 541 CE and spread across the Mediterranean world in what was probably the first pandemic of bubonic plague in recorded history, killing perhaps a quarter of the population of the eastern Mediterranean over the following 2 centuries of recurrence. The plague arrived on grain ships from Egypt, carried by the rats that inhabited those ships and the fleas that inhabited the rats, and it spread along exactly the same maritime routes that carried Byzantine trade. The ships that kept the empire fed also carried the disease that helped hollow it out. The population collapse caused by the plague contributed to the military difficulties Justinian's successors faced, the reduced agricultural productivity that strained imperial finances, and the long-term weakening of Byzantine power that made the Arab conquests of the 7th century possible. The Byzantine wrecks that have been found in the Mediterranean tell the story of this empire's maritime life, with the same kind of granular specificity that we have come to expect from underwater archaeology. The Asiada wrecks, excavated by George Bass and his colleagues off the Turkish coast in the 1960s and early 1970s in the earlier systematic deep water excavation projects in history, are Byzantine merchant ships of the 7th century CE. One of them was carrying a cargo of nearly 900 amphorae when it sank, along with the personal belongings of its crew, steelyard weights, copper coins, a set of fishing gear, lamps, and a collection of navigational equipment that tells us something about how Byzantine merchant sailors oriented themselves at sea. The ship itself was modest, a working vessel of medium size, not a naval galley or a wealthy merchant's prize ship, and its modesty is part of its value because it gives us a picture of the ordinary commercial life of the empire, the everyday movement of goods along the Byzantine sea lanes, that is just as important as the grand political narrative. The Byzantine Empire's relationship with the sea ultimately ended the way all imperial relationships with the sea end, not in a single dramatic defeat, but in a slow erosion of the capacity to project power across the water. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the empire had been forced to grant trading privileges to Venetian and Genoese merchants that effectively handed control of Byzantine commercial shipping to Italian city-states. By the 13th century, after the catastrophic Fourth Crusade of 1204, in which Western Crusaders, theoretically on their way to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, instead sacked Constantinople and established a Latin empire in its place, the empire had fragmented into successor states. When it was finally reunited under the Palaeologan dynasty in 1261, it was a shadow of itself, controlling little beyond Constantinople and a few scattered possessions. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, defending the walls of his city against the Ottoman cannons in 1453, was defending something that was already more a symbol than an empire. But what a symbol! 977 years, the longest-running continuous government in the history of the Western world. And the sea, our sea, the Mediterranean that the Romans had named and the Byzantines had kept, had been with it all the way to the end.